Let me start by thanking all of you for coming here today, and I really mean it. It has been an immense voyage, for lack of a better word, over the last 1.5, 2 years to organize all these roundtables, get all these people together, and discuss with all of you and with about 400 people altogether what corporate governance could look like over the next decades, we hope. So what started us off? Well, we've heard John Kay say a lot about this, but we think starting with this project, we had sort of this intuition that shareholder value was something that was completely embedded in corporate governance theory and practice. It's not something that's just a culture in one company. It's not something that is just in a market model of corporate governance. It's completely embedded in everything that corporate governance is and does and says. Why would we bother about it? Well, obviously, especially from the perspective of Frank Bold, but also of a lot of other NGOs, there's a lot of risks involved, both for companies and for societies, and in terms of systemic risks that follow from the model of corporate governance. So diminished long-term corporate resilience, in the sense that the longevity of companies actually declines as a result of using maximizing shareholder value as the guiding principle. Slower innovation and economic growth because a larger percentage of the profits is being reamed off and given to shareholders rather than being reinvested in companies or used for human capital development. By the same token, a diminished ability for companies to create value over the long term, and a diminished capacity for boards to anticipate and mitigate systemic risks, including sustainability and economic instability. That then expands both into in-firm inequality in terms of the massive explosion of CEO pay, but it also expands into societal inequality, which we are reaping the fruits of right now. So all in all, we think that there's a link between what corporate governance has become over the last 30 years and how it affects a very wide range of actors, including corporations in themselves, shareholders, mostly long-term shareholders, as people like Leo Strine would argue, long-term beneficiaries, for instance, in pension funds, who are very committed to the market value of corporations, but who also want to see long-term development of market value rather than short-term market value development, states, CSOs. So this whole gamut of actors is actually involved in the outcomes of what corporate governance is and should be. So we decided to treat this as a systemic problem rather than an individual problem that only takes place in one sector. And what we found is that there's a huge amount of people out there, not just converted that we will probably find here, but quite a lot of major actors out there as well, who have the same shared sense of urgency about this model producing unwanted outcomes in terms of short-term value creation. At the same time, we also find that there's a lack of alternatives, right? We've tried CSR, we've tried enlightened shareholder value, we've tried stewardship. They have not produced what they should be producing for companies, for states, for NGOs, for societies. So what we need is a comprehensive rethink of what corporate governance is and what it's for. We started out doing this in the Modern Corporation Project about 2.5 years ago, and what we try to do is try to find some sort of an interdisciplinary problematization of the concept of maximizing shareholder value in corporate governance. We asked leading scholars in company law, economics, accounting, politics, and management to provide succinct statements that would allow us to make a sort of a comprehensive idea of why corporate governance is not functioning in these specific academic domains, and why we could actually try and find some sort of an alternative to what corporate governance could be. We have shared those succinct statements with you on the USB key that you've all received this morning when you registered. To expand on that academic problematizations, that theoretical problematization, we decided that it would be a really good idea to team up again and to start the Purpose of the Corporation project, which was headed by Frank Bold. And the idea was to sort of try and find ways to foster a consensus on a new model of corporate governance, look at best practices out there, see what people have been developing over the last decade in terms of viable alternatives, possibly jurisdictional alternatives that would not be easily translatable into other jurisdictions, but might nonetheless provide a valid point of view in sense of how you could do corporate governance in a different way. So the Purpose of the Corporation project was very much about going from theory to practice and back again. trying to combine practitioners and academics in that one project who shared that sense of urgency and would be able to sort of share with us what their particular view on perhaps an aspect of corporate governance could be, and we could try to sort of bring that together. The underlying idea was to find a comprehensive problematization rather than just focus on one aspect. And the underlying focus in that model was actually to look at how companies can focus on long-term sustainable value creation rather than maximizing shareholder value. We have been extremely lucky to have an immense amount of very helpful partners who have all around the world who have sustained this project and who have helped to make this a success. Some of them are mentioned here. You'll find them in the booklet as well. So what did we try to do with these roundtables, and what will you find in the report? There's an overview of the issues, an overview of the problems, an overview of sort of the risks that the current model of corporate governance brings in our view and the view of most of the people that we've spoken to over the last 3 years. We also try to provide the start of a comprehensive answer at a systemic level. How can we actually rethink corporate governance to produce the kind of answers that we find desirable? And we indicate where embedded jurisdictional best practices may be found. We have tried to find those in the US, we found those in Europe. Obviously, answers in the US will probably be more geared towards shareholders. Answers in continental Europe may be more geared towards finding other types of models that, for instance, do two-tier board systems. Those are not necessarily answers that can be mapped from one jurisdiction on the other. Nevertheless, they all give indications of where we should look for possible answers. What we did is the roundtables themselves were held under Chatham House rules. We collated the discussions in those roundtables. The discussions were sent out to academics for comments and for additions, then sent out again to the participants to check whether what was in there was actually what they had said in the roundtables. We haven't had many people stand up and say, well, that was not exactly what we said. So we may, to some extent, assume that it reflects what participants actually thought at the roundtables. So what did we come up with? Basically, what we say is there's 7 basic fields in which corporate governance moves and where we can actually extend on the current model and maybe find other best practices in terms of how you could redo corporate governance. Purpose of the corporation is a central one. I'll say a little bit more about that in a little while. Fiduciary duties, the board role, executive pay, corporate reporting, long-term shareholding, and stakeholder voice. All of these issues are on the agenda already with different parties, many of them already present in the room, but we think going at this from a comprehensive perspective allows us to potentially add something to the debate. Obviously, and I think John Kay has set this up in an immensely better fashion than I ever could. The central issue is obviously purpose, right? What we find is that since the 1970s, shareholder primacy has taken over. This is an extremely normative approach in which boards are directed to attend to shareholders' interests primarily, and it has become embedded in the institutions of corporate governance ever since. However, one of the central outcomes of the project and of many other projects that we have been engaging with is that company actually mandates the direction of board duties towards the corporation, not towards the market or towards market values or toward market actors, right? It also permits necessarily of a broad perspective on the purpose of the corporation. So there is nothing in company law that actually mandates boards to do maximization of shareholder value. Basically, the breadth of corporate purpose determines a corporation's ability to recognize, respect, and balance stakeholders' needs, right? So if this is what is central to what a corporation can do over the long term, we say that the purpose of the public corporation, and this is more or less based on what was being said by most of the participants in the roundtables, is to create sustainable long-term value while contributing to societal well-being and environmental sustainability. By the same token, fiduciary duties for boards become directed toward the corporation, and this requires boards to create and maintain a governance system that produces long-term sustainable value in the interests of all corporate stakeholders and of society at large. So this is the sort of the basic setup where we start from. Obviously, the current institutional framework for corporate governance is not reflecting that idea of purpose, right? We say that it's deficient at a systemic level and creates broad negative impacts. It leads to this shared sense of urgency between a large set of actors in the field, but there's still lack of clarity on how to advance the model of a whole. We start with purpose, we work towards sustainable long-term value, and we say that fiduciary duties are owed toward a corporation. What we want is to develop corporate governance theory and practice to a standard where they may contribute to this idea of purpose and towards these objectives. There's a couple of caveats that I want to mention here as an academic, right? Recommendations are taken from what people said in roundtables. We didn't deviate too far from it. So that means that the best practices that are mentioned are actually those that were mentioned in the roundtables. They may not be complete. They may miss important other options that were not necessarily answered in those roundtables. They may also not be applicable to every company or every jurisdiction. They may be controversial as well. What we want to do is provide a platform that provides the basic ideas for a discussion and change on a systemic level in relation to corporate governance. And obviously, choices, recommendations, errors are all ours, not the participants, right? What we will do next in this, in the breakout panels is that we will address each of the main themes individually. The panels will discuss those recommendations, and we hope that we will have a vibrant debate around those recommendations. We will indicate the schedule of the rooms and the individual recommendations just after this presentation. And we want you to reflect on what would be the most promising avenues for change in 3 to 5 years in terms of policy and practice development. We will then collate your answers, and we will present those, the outcomes of those discussions at the final panel this afternoon. Thank you very much. We will now go to the coffee break, 5 minutes. These are the breakout sessions and the rooms that we will meet in this afternoon. Right, thank you.